Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to introduce Benjamin Wallace, who has written for Salon, GQ, Food and Wine, and Philadelphia, where he was also executive editor. Today, he'll be discussing his New York Times bestseller, The Billionaire's Vinegar, which investigates the suspect 1985 sale of a bottle of Château Lafite Bordeaux for $156,000 to a member of the Forbes family. Did Kip Forbes actually buy a bottle of 1983 Franzia? Stay tuned to find out. After the talk, there'll be time for questions, so you can line up at that microphone over there. I think there's space behind it. And after that, Mr. Wallace will be signing books over at that table. So please join me in welcoming Benjamin Wallace.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. So I've watched some of the authors at Google YouTube videos and seen that a staple of a presentation at Google is to first tell you that Google was critical to the making of my book. And Google was critical to the making of my book for all the expected reasons, but Google is also interesting to me because it was the non-existence of Google that allowed me to write this book, because the story that this book tells, it's a true story of the longest running mystery in the modern wine world. And that mystery remained a mystery for about 20 years. And the reason it remained a mystery was because there was a lot of compartmentalization of information. There were different people who knew different parts of the story, but none of them had ever pieced it together. And it's unimaginable to me that today, with Google and other search engines, that this mystery could persist in that way, because everyone would have exchanged information and sort of seen the big picture a lot sooner. So the true story that this book tells is the story of this one bottle of wine and some other bottles that were found with it in 1985. And that bottle is the 1787 Château Lafite that supposedly belonged to Thomas Jefferson. It was engraved with his initials, and it was apparently discovered in Paris very serendipitously in the mid-'80s and then sold for a record price. And the way I came to this story was, I was not a wine person especially. I mean, I like wine like most people do. I was more of a foodie, but what I was a really big fan of a certain type of book, a kind of narrative nonfiction book, such as, if you've read any of these, The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester, or The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean, or Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. True stories that were just incredibly compelling, but you'd get to the end of them and you also realized that you'd learned a huge amount. And when I was not that knowledgeable about wine, not that I'm so much more knowledgeable about it now, but when I was even less knowledgeable, I wanted to know more, and I was a little bit frustrated that all of the books in the bookstore about wine are either Wine for Dummies or books like that, or a history of weather patterns in the Côte d'Or in Burgundy, so encyclopedic things like that. And I wished that there was one of these other types of books about wine where you kind of incidentally learn about the topic while you're reading a great story. And so I set out to find a story like that. And an early idea was to write a biography of a single bottle of wine. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Red Violin, but I thought a story like that might be a way to write about wine. And the next step was to think, well, if I'm going to write a biography of a bottle of wine, meaning the people who made it and the process by which it was made and what happened to that bottle after it was made and different hands that it went through, I might as well find the single most interesting bottle of wine on the planet to write about. And that search then led me to this bottle. I was reading a memoir by an English wine writer named Jancis Robinson, and she sort of obliquely referred to this bottle and some of the characters who had intersected with it, and it seemed really promising, and I started doing some initial interviews with some of the main players and reading some of the relevant documents, and the story just kept getting better and better. And I'm going to read a little bit and talk a little bit, and at the end take questions. And the first passage I would like to read is the auction in 1985 that kind of kicked off this story. And the auctioneer is a gentleman named Michael Broadbent, who in the wine world is kind of a legendary character. Even today, he's 82, and even today he rides around London on a 3-speed women's bicycle with a basket. And he looks very aristocratic, and he has a pretty colorful way of describing wine. He often seems to liken wines to women. So he described one wine as, like a middle-aged woman with her slip showing. A little more racily, he described another wine as redolent of chocolate and schoolgirls' uniforms. His words. Michael Broadbent is also pretty much responsible for creating the modern international wine auction market. He founded Christie's wine department in the late 60s, and as a result of being kind of the first guy on the scene, he developed pretty much the most experienced palate in the world, and he's published a giant tome that's a compendium of tastes, sort of a record of every wine that's ever passed his lips, and he's tasted, more old and rare wines than just about anybody else. So he is the auctioneer in this auction that I'm about to read about. The taste of the wine he was selling right now in London, just past 2:30 p.m. on Thursday, December 5th, 1985, was impossible to know. December 5th had special meaning for Broadbent. It was the same date that James Christie, in 1766, had held the auction house's very first sale. Moments earlier, Broadbent had stepped up to the rostrum in a three-piece suit with a pocket square and peered out at the room through his eyeglasses. Lot 337 was the first item of the afternoon session and had been carefully removed from its green felt berth in a glass case nearby. Lucy Godsell, a secretary in Broadbent's office, held the bottle aloft for the room to see. She looked very Christie's, blonde, headband, pearl necklace, and Broadbent liked her. She was smart, hardworking, and pretty. Broadbent had never sold anything quite like this before. A Château Lafite from 1787, it was the oldest authenticated vintage red wine ever to come up for auction at Christie's, and that was the least of its merits. The bottle was engraved with the initials THJ. As Broadbent had described it in the auction catalog, THJ are the initials of Thomas Jefferson. Almost miraculously, the bottle was full of wine and appeared to have survived 2 centuries intact. The container itself was beautiful and distinctive. This is one time, Broadbent quipped to the crowd, when the buyer will get something back on the bottle. The admittedly fragmentary tale of how the bottle had been found only added to its mystique. According to Hardy Rodenstock, the German collector who had consigned the bottle to Christie's, in the spring of 1985, workers tearing down a house in Paris had broken through a false wall in the basement and happened upon a hidden cache of extremely old wines. The Lafite, inscribed with the initials of the founding father, who had lived in Paris from 1784 to 1789 and was the foremost American wine connoisseur of his day, had been among them. The integrity of the seals and the high fill levels, Rodenstock had told Broadbent, were remarkable for their age. The cellar had been almost hermetically preserved, its steady temperature in the sweet spot of 50 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Rodenstock theorized that the bottles had been walled up to protect them during the chaos of the French Revolution and had lain undisturbed for 200 years. Not surprisingly, Rodenstock refused to divulge the precise location, the exact number of bottles, or anything else about the discovery, despite Broadbent's entreaties. Rodenstock was the leading private collector in Europe, and he had already made a name for himself in rare wine circles as an unusually skilled bottle hunter. Though he was a longtime customer of Christie's, Rodenstock was a competitor when it came to obtaining private cellars. Private cellar purchases were often cash deals that went unreported to tax authorities. A certain reticence about his sources was to be expected. Broadbent felt there were a couple of possibilities. One was that the bottle had indeed been discovered during the excavations of the old Marais district in Paris, much of which had recently been torn up and redeveloped. A rumor less credited by Broadbent, and which he had no intention of putting in the catalog copy, was that the bottle had been part of some sort of Nazi cellar. So he sold the bottle. The Forbes family bought it for $156,000. And right from the beginning, there were these questions surrounding these bottles, where they'd been found, why Hardy Rodenstock wouldn't reveal how many of them there were, why he wouldn't reveal who had sold them to him. And these questions just would not go away. And they persisted for the next 20 years. And one of the interesting things about the Jefferson bottles is they seemed to act as a kind of magnet or siren song to all the major players in the wine world. An incredible number of these wine world luminaries, auctioneers, major collectors, major wine writers, critics, Robert Parker, Georg Riedel, the Austrian crystal maker, were sort of drawn to Rodenstock in one way or another, or had their lives intersect with the Jefferson bottles in one way or another. And one of the great pleasures for me of researching this book was crossing paths with some of these really outsized, colorful characters. And Broadbent was one of them. Another was Hardy Rodenstock, who had a few claims to fame before he discovered the Jefferson bottles. One was that he would, every year, he was a former rock band manager who kind of became interested in wine and then became very obsessed with it. And he started in, I think, 1979 or 1980, throwing an annual, really decadent tasting that it was invite only. You didn't have to pay. He comped everything. He would usually partner with a restaurateur or a hotelier, and you went and you drank this incredible assemblage of, ridiculously rare wines that nobody else seemed to be able to get their hands on. And the food was free and the hotel was free, and these were just amazing, bacchanalian events. And the other thing that Rodenstock was famous for was this uncanny knack for discovering these troves of rare wines. Nobody else would find these wines that Rodenstock could find. I mean, he, got the lost Tsar's cellar of Yquem. Yquem is the most famous sweet wine, and the Tsars were big procurers of it. And Rodenstock claimed that he had some source at Lufthansa who was smuggling them out of Soviet Russia for him. There was another cache in Caracas, Venezuela, that he paid over $1 million in cash for, supposedly, that contained an incredible assortment of wines. And then, most famously, there were the Jefferson bottles. And a third pretty interesting guy who intersects with the bottles and ends up playing a very important role in the story is a guy named Bill Koch. Bill Koch is a billionaire who divides his time between Palm Beach and Cape Cod. His wealth originally came from family money, oil and gas, an oil and gas fortune in Kansas. He ended up in a dispute with his brothers over the fortune. It went to court. Ultimately, in the 80s, he got a $470 million payout. He then went back to court claiming they had, hidden assets and misrepresented the fortune, and the litigation went on for years and years. Since then, Bill Koch, in his own right, has built that wealth into a much larger fortune through his own energy company. But some of the things you need to know about Bill Koch to understand his role in the story are, number one, that litigious nature. Number two, his willingness to spend his wealth on things he's really interested in. And he ended up spending $68 million to win the America's Cup in 1992, which nobody thinks he would have won if he had not spent that kind of money at it. I mean, he was, throwing it at teams of MIT scientists to do, develop cutting-edge sails and materials and things like that, and, hiring the best sailing team. The other thing is that Bill Koch is a collector of many things. He collects paintings, he collects Americana, like the pistol that killed Jesse James. He collects little miniature models of the boats, every boat that has won or lost the America's Cup. And he collects wine, and he now has a cellar that's over 35,000 bottles. And in 2005, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts said to Bill Koch, we'd like to put on an exhibition of all of your collections. And so Bill Koch, said, great. And they said, but we're going to need paperwork, provenances for all of these objects. And Bill Koch's team quickly discovered that they didn't really have any paperwork for his Jefferson bottles. And so he had them do a little bit more research, and they discovered some of these questions that had kind of been in the air for all of these years. And at that point, Bill Koch needed to make a decision whether or not to dig deeper to find out what the real story was with these bottles. And he had recently had a sort of embarrassing experience when he had to return a trove of incredibly rare Greek coins to the Turkish government because they had not been, had the proper export paperwork. And so, that was a factor in deciding whether or not to go ahead with an investigation of these bottles. Do I want to yet again be publicly associated with, a kind of collecting debacle? So the next very brief passage I'm going to read describes Bill Koch making the decision to pursue an investigation. He ultimately did pursue an investigation and spent over $1 million on it, and used ex-FBI, ex-Scotland Yard, ex-MI5 agents. And this is when he decided to do that. Koch could have been forgiven at this point for choosing to leave well enough alone. It must have been tempting simply not to know, to continue to believe he possessed a treasure that might have belonged to Thomas Jefferson.
He risked embarrassment if it were revealed that the bottles he had paid so much for and taken such pride in were not what they seemed. He must have known that this was strictly a rich man's problem, though, as likely to arouse Schadenfreude's sympathy. He also was painfully aware that he made a soft, fat target for the press. When he had subpoenaed his 82-year-old mother, all the jackals could focus on was the stroke she'd had a few months earlier, totally disregarding that she sided with his brothers in the fraternal feud. Yes, he'd wanted to compel her testimony, but after all, he hadn't known about the stroke at the time. Once he found out about it, he abandoned his effort. When he had expelled his mistress from a $2.5 million condo he owned at the Boston Four Seasons, the media harped on how she was a single mother, and the eviction had taken place on Christmas Eve so that he could throw a party in the 3,700 square foot spread. Never mind that he could have evicted her 30 days earlier. When he was arrested for domestic violence, after his second wife accused him of punching her in the stomach and threatening to beat his whole family to death with his belt, the hacks were all over it, neglecting to point out that witnesses to the altercation had disputed his wife's account and that she later recanted it. The charges were ultimately dismissed. Although a court issued a restraining order against Koch, his Palm Beach estate was spacious enough that he was able to stay in a beach house on the property and still be in compliance. Koch's darker side was mitigated by a disarming willingness to introspect in public. About his years in psychoanalysis, say, "For a long time, I didn't think I was worth shit." Or his short fuse, "I could be a really nasty prick. I'd go up to my secretary and say, 'You dumb shit, why'd you make that mistake?' I was that kind of guy." But the candor didn't always help his case. A 1994 Vanity Fair profile, written with Koch's masochistic cooperation, had been a mutilation without anesthetic, likening his paranoia to Richard Nixon's and his dissembling to Bill Clinton's, and saying Koch is a man whose closet is free of skeletons, in large part because they all seem to be turning somersaults in his living room. Worst of all was the Boston press, which delighted in quoting from naughty love letters between Koch and his X-rated Protestant princess, as the evicted mistress styled herself. "My body parts are like moist orchids in bloom," she wrote in one fax. Koch, somewhat less steamily, described his ardor as beyond calculation by the largest computers. Boston reporters almost uniformly deemed the MFA show crass and egotistical. Boston Globe columnist Alex Beam was especially caustic, gratuitously noting that Koch rhymes with joke, and disinterring the moldy beat his family to death with a belt threat allegation. With Koch talking about a lawsuit, the Globe subsequently ran a fairly groveling editor's note acknowledging the conflicting evidence. But who reads editor's notes? Koch felt he couldn't get a fair shake. On the other hand, Koch couldn't stomach feeling taken advantage of. In 1985, after deciding that his brothers had cheated him in their settlement, Koch had gone back to court. What followed, Bill Koch said later, would make Dallas and Dynasty look like a playpen. There were private detectives and wiretaps and room bugs and body mics and stolen garbage bags and scurrilous whispering campaigns. There was even a mysterious Israeli security consultant whom Koch's own employees later accused of taping their calls at Koch's behest, a charge Koch denies. Many more lawsuits followed. Fortune called it perhaps the nastiest family feud in American business history. The same mix of traits that had mired Koch in ruinous litigation and led him to victory in the America's Cup: contrarian determination, a belief in technology and professional investigators, scads of money, a profound need to win, and an impish glee at sticking it to the man, or, it sometimes seemed, the straw man, would prove equally useful when it came to the Jefferson bottles. In the end, Koch decided to get to the bottom of the matter, and the person he charged with investigating it was a former FBI agent named Jim Elroy. So the last third of the book details Koch's investigation. And I don't want to give away the ending, so I'm not going to tell you what the results were. But beyond the mystery of the origin and authenticity of the Jefferson bottles, for me from the beginning there loomed another mystery, which was, why would you spend $156,000 on a bottle of wine? Could it possibly stand up to the price tag? Can a 200-year-old wine really be drinkable and even taste good? And so the last short passage I'm going to read addresses that question of whether or not wine that old can be drinkable. Whether the wine would be drinkable or not, and if it was, what it would taste like, was a whole other matter. The 1784 and 1787 vintages of Yquem opened by Rodenstock earlier in the year had drawn rave reviews. But that most concentrated of the Sauterne dessert wines, with high alcohol and residual sugar, was better constituted than red table wine to withstand the vinegarizing ravages of bacteria. Red wine was different. No merchant or wine writer was going to say of the 1982 vintage, drink now through 2182. The finest Bordeaux might peak after 20 years, stay on that plateau for another 15, and then begin to decline. Yet old wine drinkers routinely opened bottles that were more than 100 years old and spoke of them as if they were still in their prime. How is this possible? It was true that some of the wines Broadbent had turned up in pristine castle cellars had been untouched for more than a century and still dazzled tasters. But such wines were outliers, and the oldest was only 130 years or so. Even the best were appreciated more by the mind than the tongue or nose. They garnered faint praise, like still very much alive. The best Baron Elie de Rothschild had been able to say of the 1799 Lafite opened at Marvin Overton's seminal vertical tasting in Dallas in 1979 was, "It's wine." Of course, many old wines disappointed. You never knew until you opened it how a bottle would be. When Broadbent tried an 1875 Margaux, he rhapsodized about its extraordinary nose like crystallized violets and clean bandages. At another event, however, he glumly lamented the state of an 1858 Mouton, wincing at its incredibly awful creosote tarry smell, before jotting in his notebook the ultimate condemnation: not tasted. One of his favorite stories involved a bottle of 1898 Lafite and the legendary Napa Valley consultant Andrei Chelostov. At one of the Hubline auctions run by Broadbent, the 4'11" Chelostov had sampled the old wine and told the room in his emigre's Russian accent, "Tasting old wine is like making love to an old lady." After a pause, he had continued, "It is possible." After another pause, "It can even be enjoyable." And then, following one last sip, "But it requires a little bit of imagination." Now, in the case of the bottle that the Forbes family bought, we will never know the answer to the question of what it would have tasted like after 200 years. The Forbes family bought their bottle. They collect wine. They have a great wine cellar, but they also collect presidential memorabilia. And they collected this Jefferson bottle for the presidential memorabilia collection. And so they did not put it in the wine cellar. They displayed it in their galleries in downtown Manhattan. And specifically, they displayed it under a halogen light, which, if any of you know anything about cellaring wine, is not what you'd call ideal conditions for a bottle of wine. And about a year after they bought the bottle, a curator was walking through the galleries and noticed something dark bobbing in the liquid. And sure enough, the light had dried out the cork and it had fallen in. If anyone has any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
So I had the same question really regarding how wines would actually taste after 200 years. But then aren't most collector wines like 100 years older or older, not meant to be like opened at all? I mean, don't most people just collect wines for, as you say, displaying and as more as a trophy collection or a piece of art rather than drinking? Do you have any idea of how many people actually go ahead and drink their wines as opposed to just keep them as collections?
I definitely couldn't give you like a percentage breakdown, but there definitely are different types of collectors. And there are a lot of collectors who are trophy hunters who want to say, I own this wine or I own that wine. But there is absolutely a set of collectors who are very actively, pursuing and opening and drinking and tasting these bottles. And they're so obsessed with it that, they're just constantly scouring auction houses for these bottles. I mean, in some ways less so today because number one, the stock of them has just dwindled because a lot of them have been drunk or they really have just passed their prime. Or now that there's kind of a counterfeiting scandal, there's just a lot more doubt about whether or not what you're buying is the real thing.
So I wanted to ask your comment about two recent articles in The Economist, one being a review of your book in which unfortunately they do give away the ending. And the second was a different thing in which they would give people the exact same bottle of wine and once tell them it was a $10 bottle of wine and the second time giving them telling them it was an $80 bottle of wine. And almost uniformly people would think the wine tasted better when told it was an $80 bottle of wine. And does that have something to do with, I want to say, the potlatch appeal of expensive bottles of wine costing $100,000?
Well, to your first question, I mean, if I had my druthers, The Economist would not have given away the ending. But on the other hand, I'll take a review in The Economist any day. Okay. So, the other article you're talking about, I believe, is in regard to a Stanford Caltech study where they actually did brain imaging while people were tasting the same wine labeled with different prices. Mm-hmm. And not only did they say that the wine they thought was $80 tasted better than the $10 bottle, their brain actually registered that they were experiencing more pleasure while drinking it. It was a fascinating study, and I think it's very revealing about the role of psychology and suggestibility in wine drinking. It's really not, there's no clear line where it's, the wine or your perception of the wine. It really is very subjective.
I mean, does that have something to do with these?
Well, I mean, with something like this, which they never really intended to drink, no. But with some, let's say, $7,000 and $10,000, dollar bottles of wine, which people do buy and hope to drink, I definitely think, that's the case. I mean, they think because it costs more, it tastes better. And I was fortunate in November to go to a tasting in Los Angeles, hosted by a guy named Bipin Desai, who's a theoretical physicist at UC Riverside, but he also is sort of the preeminent organizer of rare wine tastings. And it was a vertical is a tasting where you're drinking multiple vintages of a single chateau, as opposed to what's called a horizontal tasting where you're drinking one vintage, multiple chateau. So this tasting was a double vertical of Chateau Cheval Blanc, which is a famous red Bordeaux, back to 1921, and a vertical of Chateau Yquem, the most famous sweet wine, back to 1899. Okay. And, I don't profess to have the world's, greatest palate, but it all just kind of blurred together for me. I mean, I did, I got to, attend for free because I'm a journalist, but other people there were paying $7,000 to be there for the weekend, and I cannot imagine thinking it was worth it if it had been my money being spent.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can you talk at all about how winemaking techniques have changed over time and how that impacts either the way people pursue older wines or enjoy older wines? And are there certain tastes or ingredients or techniques that were used for wines 80, 100 years old that just don't exist anymore? And so there's some scarcity value just in the winemaking itself, aside from the volume of those bottles available.
Well, something happened in Bordeaux in the mid to late 19th century called the phylloxera epidemic. Phylloxera was a root louse that just devastated Bordeaux. And it was a problem they did not overcome for years, and eventually they found that American rootstocks were immune to this pest, and so they solved the problem by regrafting all of their vines onto American rootstocks. So all of Europe's greatest wines today are actually, built on American rootstocks. But the kind of hyper connoisseurs that are part of this subculture, a lot of them do believe that what are called pre-phylloxera wines, the wines that were made, from completely European vines that had been in the soil for centuries, they believe those are superior wines. And Hardy Rodenstock in particular, this was kind of one of his pet causes was, you can't make wines as good anymore. You just can't, because they're made differently now. And that was actually part of his, I think, shtick in convincing people to pay huge amounts for his wines, because he said you just can't get the same experience from these more recent ones. Beyond that, I would say wine making technology has improved so massively and become so systematized that the overall quality of wine, especially just reasonable, affordable wine for most people, is much greater than it ever was. So in general, I would say across the board, it's gotten better, but someone like Hardy Rodenstock would argue that sort of the very peaks are a little bit lower. What else?
Are there any more questions? Because we're going to do book signing. There's nothing else. Anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks.